What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. As you guys know, Tacomas have a notorious problem with the carrier bearings, and today we're going to install the solution to that problem. For those of you that are not familiar with what a carrier bearing is, it's on your driveline to the rear, and when you have one that's going bad, you may get some sensations such as some vibrations coming from the rear of the truck when you take off from a stoplight that's smoothed out with speed, or you may even get some clanking. And that clanking you're hearing is actually the splines on your slip yoke here. Having a bad carrier bearing can make this clanking even worse, and the clanking here is actually from this not being a greasable joint like they are on most of other old Toyotas. So we'll also cover greasing this with the proper lubricant to keep this thing from making noise as well. As you can see, our carrier bearing here has a ton of play in it and just super sloppy, and this is actually the third one that I put on here. I have two other videos on doing this. First video is replacement. Second video was me actually flipping my slip yoke to the differential side. So yours from the factory will not look like this. Your slip yoke will be up here, and I only did that for clearance off-road. It is not necessary, so don't let that confuse you on the video here. So this is what we are going to be replacing the factory style carrier bearing with, and it's made by Mitchmadeinc out of Southern California. I saw him post about making these for two-wheel drive pre-runner trucks, and I asked him if it would work on four-wheel drive, and he said it wouldn't, but he was working on getting their four-wheel drive ready and available. As soon as it came out and ready for pre-order, I went ahead and placed my order, and of course now here we are. Just to give you a little rundown about this, it's all billet aluminum, and we got our serviceable Timken bearing in there. So if the bearing ever wears out, you can just remove that snap ring and replace your bearing. You don't have to replace this whole assembly. It is adjustable, and I will get into that later. Don't be intimidated by that aspect. He sent me a message and explained exactly how it works. It'll be super easy, so let's dive right into it. So our first step after getting the drive shaft out of the truck is we're gonna remove these clips, and these are basically what just capture the caps of our U-joint. Toyota ones are nice and simple. You can just take some pliers and squeeze like this, and then just remove them. And go ahead and repeat the process on all four sides. If you end up getting one that's a little stuck, mine have been out before, so they're coming out nice and easy. You may have to take a hammer and a chisel and just kind of knock them loose, or maybe do a wire brush, a little bit of compressed air, WD-40, and just clean it up if it's your factory ones that have never been out before. Now that we have our drive shaft sitting in the vise how we need it, I'm going to show you what you're going to need to do to actually be able to knock these caps out and get the U-joint out. One thing you're going to need is a socket, and this socket has to be big enough to where the cap of the U-joint will be able to go up through it. And then we are supporting the yoke with the jaws of our vise. I know it looks like this is going to touch, but there is a gap, and I'm not going to have to worry about this hitting. So what we're going to do is put our socket up here. We're going to hit this with a hammer, and then as we do that, because we are supporting this other yoke, it is gonna drive our cap up and out of our hole here, and that's why it is important for us to have a socket that's gonna allow that to fit through there. So now we'll go ahead and hold our socket and give this a few taps and see if this cap's gonna move easy for us. And there you go. As you can see, this cap's already starting to protrude up through here. So what we're gonna do is give this a few more taps until it's protruding pretty much as it'll go. And then we're gonna flip the drive shaft over 180 degrees and do the other cap. And then from that point, we'll be able to actually pull the cross of the U-joint out of its caps, and then go ahead and smack our caps out of the rest of the yoke. Another thing to note is make sure you index your drive shaft so you know how it came off and how you want it to go back on. You see I have a white line here, here, and then here. So now that we got our caps loose, we rotate this around. This one, yeah. So we'll go ahead and pull this cap out. And of course you can do this and save your U-joint and reuse it if you're real careful. I always just have a spare one on hand because you never know what's gonna happen. The little needles that are in these caps can get broken or lost, and then you're just kind of out of luck there. But with our cap removed on that side, now we can swing this over, and then that allowed us to actually separate the shafts. And then we'll just take a chisel and knock this other cap out. Now it's time to get the rest of our U-joint out of the way so we can remove our nut. And just to give you guys a clearer picture, because the other situation may not have been very clear, we are supporting the opposite sides of the U-joint. So then when we take our socket up here and hit it with a hammer, it is forcing this U-joint upwards, which forces that cap upwards. And we do that to both sides and allows us to remove it. Now we flip to our other side. Much more manageable without the other half of the drive shaft hanging there. Our other cap just fell out, and that's kind of a situation I was talking about where the needle bearings could get lost. Luckily there's enough grease in there. I didn't lose any. I plan to keep this U-joint as a spare in the truck. I don't really plan to put it in service unless I have to. So now you can see our U-joint's already come out. So I will set this on the bench, and then we will take a chisel and get our cap out. With our U-joint out of the way, what we have left exposed is our 15/16 nut. And as you can see here, there's a stake mark in it. So if you guys are familiar with axle nuts, you stake them so they don't come loose. Well, same goes for this. So what we'll do is undo our stake with a chisel like this, and then we'll take our impact and remove our nut. With our nut removed, there's also a washer you gotta get out. So here's the part that may be a little different for some of you guys. As I've mentioned before, I've had this off before. I've already got this indexed. I know exactly where it's gonna go back on, and I know it's gonna slide off nice and easy. Now, if it is stuck, I recommend you just take a hammer, give it some taps here, and usually that does the trick. Worst case scenario, you'll have to use a puller, which pushes pressure on your main stud here, and then has jaws that grab there, but I've never had to resort to that. Usually a hammer does the trick. So go ahead and remove it, and then we'll work on getting our carrier bearing off. Now with the yoke out of the way, we're gonna remove the carrier bearing bushing off of the bearing that's on there, and you can just do that with a screwdriver. You can see, especially when they're worn out, they just pry right off. And so now we're left with just the bearing from the carrier bearing itself that we need to remove. Now for removing this bearing, it is press on in a sense. It's not super tight. I recommend taking a chisel or a punch or something of that sort. And I kind of just have my drive shaft sitting up against my vise here. It's not clamped or anything. You can clamp it, but if you do clamp it, do not clamp it tight. I'm telling you right now, just barely clamp it. So I did get it to move without it in the vise, but in the end, it was moving around too much for me to get this off. So now I've got it in the vise, and as I mentioned, just super light. Nothing that's gonna dent the shaft and cause vibrations. It's actually slightly sliding in the vise because I have it so loose. Before we can install our new carrier bearing assembly, we have some dust shields that we're gonna have to remove because they'll actually interfere with the billet housing, and all they're gonna do is just hold dirt in there and cause it to fail prematurely. So there's one on this side, and then there's also one on this side. They will simply knock off with a chisel. May have to work at them a little bit, but they're gonna come off, and don't worry because you won't need them again. You see that side already moved. There we go. We got that side off, and we'll go ahead and clean that surface up. And then next I'll go ahead and remove this one, and then we'll get ready for installation. Technically it could go on either way, but we're gonna suggest that you put the C-clip facing the rear differential of the truck. I did put a little bit of oil on the surfaces here to help it slide on nice and smooth. You'll notice it'll get started, but it won't seat all the way. Here, you should not grab a hammer and start hitting this. First off, you're gonna mar this up, and second off, you're gonna prematurely hurt your bearing in here. So what we're gonna do instead is reference our index mark from our yoke here, reference it on our drive shaft, get our yoke back where it was, and then now that this yoke is actually gonna be pressing on that inner race of the bearing and not damaging it. So we can give it some light taps, and it knocks it on just like that. And as you can see, spins nice and freely, and it's not bound up, and everything seems to be great. Now we can go ahead and replace our washer that we pulled off, as well as our nut. And we are just reusing it. I'm sure the Toyota manual probably tells you to put a new one on there. It'll be just fine. We'll zip it up with the impact gun, and then we'll torque it down to 134 foot-pounds. All I'm doing to torque it is getting our torque wrench on there and then getting a pry bar in here. And I know it could mess up that inner surface, but it's not gonna be that much pressure. All right. And then we'll get out our chisel, and we'll go ahead and put a stake back in our nut. I've had some people in past videos gripe about me having this in a vise, and I just want to show you guys exactly how loose it is in there. I'm going to take my finger and push it down. I mean, it was not clamped down at all. It's not going to cause any dents, and it's also not going to cause any vibrations, not to mention it'll be banging this thing up against rocks anyways. So that's for all you people that are concerned about that. Now before we install our U-joint, first thing I like to do is go ahead and get out a little tub of grease. Like I mentioned in the past, those pins and the caps are really easy to misplace and get out of line. So we'll go ahead and remove all of our caps here. And then what I'm doing is actually taking extra grease and putting extra grease in here. And what that grease is doing is just keeping these pins from moving around. Don't worry about there being excess. There's channels all through this U-joint, so any excess grease will just get shot through the channels and into appropriate places. So it's not gonna hurt at all. It's actually just going to help and make your life a whole lot easier so you don't end up having a pin fold over, and then you won't be able to get your U-joint assembled. If you do have a pin fold over and say you break one and have to take it back apart and this, that, and the other, if you still have your old U-joint here, you can salvage some pins from there and take a little screwdriver and get them back in place, have it good to go. But I recommend just doing good practice the first time around and not have to worry about that. So assembly is just about as easy as disassembly was. We're gonna take one of our caps, we're gonna slide it in our end here with our U-joint, get that started. And typically I would open up the jaws of the vise until I could clamp on this and actually push them together. But I just found out that my vise jaws are not wide enough to do that. The one at work is plenty wide and this one of course isn't. So we're gonna do a little bit different method. What I'm gonna do is rotate it like this, and then I'm gonna take this plastic hammer and hold my U-joint and hopefully get our cap. There we go. So now that we got that cap flush, I'm still not gonna have it work the way I want because I'm not gonna be able to get a socket in there. So we're just gonna have to do this a completely different method. From here, if your vise was wide enough, you could open it up. You could put your other cap here and then close your vise and the jaws would actually squish the cap down onto the other one. And that just makes it super simple. So if you don't have a vise, this will be a special video for you because it'll teach you how to do it without one. Next, we'll get our other cap. We'll get that started. And what I like to do is kind of move this U-joint up until it's kind of seated in those splines. And you want to get it in that happy medium between the two. Because if the cylinder part of the U-joint is in between the needles, it's going to keep them from dropping out on us. I know I've probably called those splines a few times now, but we'll go ahead and take our hammer again. All right, and as you can see, now it's moving nice and free in between those. Then we'll just take a socket that's about the same size as our cap. So now that we've got this cap sunk down to where our snap ring groove is exposed, we can go ahead and take pliers and our snap ring from earlier and get it seated in on one side. We can flip the drive shaft over. We will take our socket again and we're gonna seat this side. Now we got this one down, we can get our snap ring in, and you'll notice how loose this one is. And that's because actually our cap is pushed too far down, but that's okay, we'll be able to correct that later. You'll even notice the U-joint itself doesn't rotate super easy. Don't worry about that. If you had dropped a needle, you would not be able to get either of these snap rings in right now. Now we're simply gonna do the same thing we did with the other side. This one can be a little bit more tricky because you're juggling. I would recommend getting a cap almost all the way started in there, just enough to where you get a good head start, but not enough to where you can't get this in there. So go ahead and slip your drive shaft in. Be really careful of your needles there. Okay, that felt like it went in there and didn't drop any needles. Now what we'll do is to get our other cap, verify you have enough grease in there before you get started. As I mentioned before, having a vise to do the squeezing for you while you wiggle things around makes it so much easier than this. This is actually a little bit of a pain without the vise. I've never had to do it this way, but it works. So now that we got it slid down in there on that side, I am gonna go ahead and rotate this to the side. And my reason for doing this is I wanna drive this cap in more. And by driving this cap in more, it's gonna verify that we're not gonna slip out of this side while we're trying to get the other side started and then end up losing needles and dropping them in there. Hold the drive shaft up against the cap, and then we're gonna take this hammer since it's not gonna mar this thing up, and hopefully it'll be enough force to actually drive this cap in. If not, we'll have to switch to the heavier one. Now we got this side in enough for us to get our snap ring in, just like we did previously. All right, with our snap ring in on that side, now we can rotate the drive shaft, and we should be able to get our cap started up here, and we'll be able to move U-joint up and allow it to get started now that we are all the way in on the other side. So there we go. Now you can see that's kind of like a happy medium in between the two. It's started on both sides. So we'll go ahead and drive this down. It's pretty much captured at this point. You're not gonna have to worry about it. Now you're gonna take your socket and you're gonna beat this down, and your snap ring groove is exposed. And if you can't get it exposed and it hits a hard stop beforehand, then the chances are you did drop a needle, and you're gonna have to pull this back apart and try again. As I mentioned before, if any of your joints felt a little stiff, if there's any roughness, I would be worried you dropped a needle, but if it's just a little stiff, that means it's tight. So what we're gonna do is support the opposite side of the cap that you wanna push out. So just like we're going to take it apart, except for with the clips in. And when you're doing this, you're making sure the caps are as far up against these clips as they possibly can be, and that leaves enough room for the U-joint to not be compressed in there and be real stiff and tight. So go ahead and do it set up like this, flip it 180 degrees, give it a few taps, and then move on to our other side, and then we should have a nice, free, easy to move U-joint that's not stiff or gritty or have any rough spots. As I mentioned previously, the clanking on the drive shaft you'll hear is actually from these splines being dry. And what I suggest you use is actually Ford Motorcraft PTFE lubricant. It's like this nice blue lubricant. I've already done mine recently, so I'm not gonna pull it back apart. Basically, you're just gonna pull one of these clamps off, index it just like you do for everything else on your drive shaft, pull it off, slather a bunch of this lubricant on there, and then reinstall it. You can reuse these pinch clamps from Toyota. It may be easier for you just to get a new one. Take a good look at how they work. It's not too hard just to reuse them. All right, guys, we are under the truck. I've had the drive shaft installed for a few weeks now, and I just want to go over how exactly you're going to be installing this. First, you can slip your flange onto your studs here, install your 14mm nuts, torque those to 65 foot-pounds, get your center support bearing bolts started. Those are 17mm, and just run them up until they're basically hand tight, and then install your rear flange, which is also 65 foot-pounds. After the front and rear are torqued, and these are just snug down hand tight, go ahead and make sure these bolts are loose, and it'll just kind of self-center. Once it's self-centered, you can remove these bolts one by one, put some Loctite on them, and then run them down and tighten them up. I do not have a torque spec on those, but not overly tight, tight enough to where they're not going to come loose. So yeah, installation is as simple as that. You guys may notice the drive shaft that's in my truck, actually the slip yoke is up front, and that's because I had to go to my other drive line. My original drive line that I put this carrier bearing on had to either be bent or knock a weight off or something just over the years of off-roading. So I actually had a vibration, and it wasn't because of the carrier bearing. The carrier bearing just helped transmit it easier. So my drive line was out of balance, but luckily I had this spare drive line that I swapped it over to, and I put it up, and it's way better. Little to no vibrations, everything to be expected from a solid carrier bearing unit like this. I was a little worried when I first put my drive shaft on there and had the vibrations. Very happy with how it turned out now that I have a balanced shaft in there. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Hop on over to Mitch's page at Mitchmadeinc on Instagram, and also I'll have his website linked in the description, as well as the product link in the description. So I hope this video was helpful. If you guys have any questions, please drop them in the comments. I will do my best to answer them, and we'll see you on the next one.